Juneteenth is an annual holiday celebrating the emancipation of those that have been enslaved in the United States. It is a mixture of June and 19th. Originating in Galveston, Texas, it is now celebrated on June 19th throughout the United States with increasing official recognition. It commemorates the anniversary date of June 19th, 1865, the announcement of General Order Number 3 by Union Army General Gordon Granger, proclaiming the freedom from slavery in the state of Texas. Welcome, this is One Mike. I'm your host, Country Boy, and as you might have guessed, this episode is about the story of Juneteenth. Also, if you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so in the show notes below by buying me coffee or supporting my Patreon page. Also, I would like to give a special shout out to our newest Patreon member, Robert Phillipson. Thank you for your continued support. Also, you can find me at onemikehistory.com and more stories like this on my website. Also, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Without further ado, let's get started. Slavery was the major cause of the Civil War, but yet when the Civil War started in 1861, neither side entered the conflict with any intention on changing slavery. White Southerners wanted to wage war to make the Confederacy an independent nation free to promote slavery as they saw fit, and white Northerners wanted to maintain the Union but had no intention on freeing a single slave. Throughout the early part of the war, Lincoln was unwavering on his focus to preserve the Union. Any policy that helped or hindered black people was secondary to that goal. So when Lincoln called for 75,000 men to enlist in the military for 90 days, the support was overwhelming from both white and black men, but only black men were rejected for military service. See, black people recognized long before white Americans that the fate of the Union was tied to black people, and the fate of the issue of slavery and the future of slavery was tied to the outcome of the Civil War. The black newspaper, the Anglo-African, stated that we are concerned in this fight that our fate hangs upon these issues. So black men in New York formed their own military companies and began to start drilling. And black people in Boston even drew up their own resolution modeled after the Declaration of Independence. Black slaves began to liberate themselves as soon as the war started, but Union generals had no actual policy with how to deal with them. White commanders showed more concern for the interests of slave owners than the people in slavery. General Ulysses S. Grant even returned runaway slaves to their owners if the owners supported the Union. In August 6, 1861, Congress clarified the state of runaway slaves with the first Confiscation Act. Federal forces could seize any property that belonged to Confederate states used in the war effort. Any slave their master used to benefit the Confederacy, and only those slaves would be freed. Union General John C. Fremont would exceed the limits by freeing all the states that belonged to the Confederates in Missouri. Lincoln told Fremont that only slaves that aided the Confederate war effort were to be freed because Lincoln worried that Fremont would drive Missouri and Kentucky to the Confederacy. Black leaders and abolitionists were displeased with Lincoln because they felt that it was foolish to fight a war against the South without fighting against slavery because the South was so dependent on slavery. But more than a year into the Civil War, Lincoln remained reluctant to strike decisively against slavery. Lincoln believed that a long-term solution was compensated emancipation for slaves following their colonization outside of the country. Slave owners would be repaid for the loss of their slaves, and slaves would be freed but forced to settle in another country in either the Caribbean, Latin America, or Western Africa. However, by the summer of 1862, border states had rejected compensated emancipation, and Lincoln finally concluded that victory and the future of the Union was tied directly to the issue of slavery. Lincoln had decided that slavery would become an instrument of war. Lincoln would use it to hasten the end of the war and restore the Union. So finally, on September 22nd, 1862, more than 2 months after Lincoln first started to consider the freedom of enslaved people, he issued issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It stipulated that anyone in bondage in states or states that remained in the rebellion after January 1st, 1863 would be henceforth and forever free. But if that Confederate state joined the Union before 1863, the slaves would remain in bondage. So in January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation. It was the first significant effort by Union authorities to assure freedom for 4 million enslaved people of African descent. Despite the excitement from black communities, the language of the Emancipation Proclamation was actually very uninspiring. The language limited the emancipation to those in areas still in the rebellion, and this did not include enslaved people in the 4 border states or areas still in the Union or areas in Confederate states that Union forces already occupied. Thus, hundreds of thousands of black people remained enslaved despite the proclamation. While the Emancipation Proclamation would mark the beginning of the end of slavery, it also authorized the enlistment of black troops into the Union Army. Just as Northern leaders began to realize that preservation of the Union made it necessary to abolish slavery, they also began to understand that black men were needed for the military effort if the Union were to win the war. Now this brings us to Juneteenth. As Northern troops advanced into the Confederate South, many enslaved people fled behind Union lines. But in Texas, slavery continued as the state experienced little to no large-scale fighting or significant Union presence. So many slavers outside of Texas actually moved there because they viewed it as a safe haven for slavery. But as the war came to a close in 1865, General Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas in June of 1865 and established what would now be Order Number 3, which signaled the freedom of Texas's 250,000 enslaved people. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance to the proclamation of the Executive of the United States that all slaves are free. This becomes an absolute equality of personal rights and the right of property between former masters and slaves. The connection henceforth existing between them will involve between employer and hired labor. Freemen are advised to remain quiet in their present homes and work for wages, and informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. But General Order Number 3 wasn't exactly instant magic for Texas's 250,000 slaves. On plantations, masters decided how to announce the news or to wait for the government to arrive to force them to free their slaves. It was not uncommon for them to delay until after the next harvest. Even in Galveston, the ex-Confederate mayor forced freedmen back to work, and those that acted on the news did so at their own risk. You would see a lot of Negroes hanging from trees right after the freedom. And in one extreme case, a former slave named Kate Darlene continued to work for her mistress for 6 years. All of this hardly seems like a recipe for a celebration, but that's what makes Juneteenth story all that more remarkable. The confusion, the delay, the terror, the violence. Still, newly freed black men and women in Texas, with the aid of the Freedmen's Bureau, rallied around that date. In one of the most inspiring grassroots efforts in the post-Civil War period, they transformed June 19th from simple military orders into an annual rite. Jubilee Day, or Juneteenth, will begin just 1 year later in 1866. Emancipation celebrations were common in this country in the late 19th, early 20th century, but they celebrated the date each state was freed, not the Juneteenth holiday. In Washington, D.C., celebration of Emancipation Day was on April 12th, the date Lincoln signed the Compensated Emancipation Act. And in some counties in Tennessee, they observed Emancipation Day on August 8th because that state was not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation because Tennessee was under Union control by June 6, 1862, 4 months before Lincoln even wrote the preliminary draft for the Emancipation Proclamation. After Reconstruction, many black leaders debated the importance of remembering milestone anniversary given how African Americans were treated in this country. But the free people of Texas went about their business celebrating their local version of Emancipation Day annually. For them, Juneteenth was the earliest incarnation of a celebration remembering lost family members, measuring progress against freedom, and ingraining the rising generation on the value of self-improvement and racial upliftment. This was accomplished through the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, religious sermons and spirituals, and the preservation of food from slavery, as well as the incorporation of new games and traditions like baseball and rodeos, and later stock car races and overhead flights. It was only strengthened in Texas in the years after the first Juneteenth because following Reconstruction, white Texans rallied around their own version of history in an effort to glorify and wash over the past cruelties and their defeats. When white Texans forbade blacks from using public spaces, black people gathered near rivers or lakes and eventually raised enough money for their own celebration site. Among them was Emancipation Park in Houston or Booker T. Washington Park in Mexia. What also helped strengthen the holiday was it moved across state lines during the Great Migration. The people of Texas took Juneteenth to cities like Los Angeles and Chicago and Detroit, and as it spread, the observation changed. And this was especially true in the 1920s because of the new age of consumerism that had infiltrated black society with advertisements for fancy Juneteenth outfits and more elaborate displays. However, despite the Great Migration and the good people of Texas, African Americans had become increasingly disconnected from their own history. So by the time of World War II, African Americans no longer faithfully celebrated their freedom from enslavement in a land that had rendered them second-class citizens worthy of dying for their country, but not worthy of sharing the same water fountains. And it's possible that this is where the story of Juneteenth would end, at least outside of Texas, had it not been for another set of remarkable events during the end of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King, his Southern Christian Leadership Conference drew in the symbolism of Juneteenth to produce a second March on Washington. Branded Solidarity Day, it became the centerpiece of the Poor People's Campaign. Martin Luther King had always planned on returning to his famous I Have a Dream speech in Washington. This led to the idea of the Poor People's Movement emphasizing America's class inequalities. Following his assassination in May 12, 1968, it fell on Reverend Ralph Abernathy and his widow, Coretta Scott King. They moved forward with the Poor People's Campaign, including the establishment of Resurrection City, which is a temporary collection of shelters along the reflecting pool in front of Lincoln Memorial, where some 2,500 poor men, women, and children lived for up to 6 weeks. In June 19, 1968, more than 50,000 Americans gathered to commemorate Juneteenth and held Solidarity Day rally and marched on Washington. By linking Solidarity Day to Juneteenth, the Poor People's Campaign connected the emancipation of enslaved people to the freedom from economic oppression for poor people of all colors. And the people at that rally took the idea of Juneteenth back to their respective communities. With the boost of energy in 1979, Texas became the first state to make Juneteenth an official holiday. And since then, 41 other states, including the District of Columbia, have recognized Juneteenth as a state holiday or as a holiday observance. Still, Juneteenth remains an unofficial national holiday and is not celebrated on a federal level. These days, Juneteenth celebrations often feature a mix of religious services and storytelling, while music, food, parades, festival, and other jubilant celebrations of Black culture also occur. Barbecue has always been a focal point of the holiday, with Texas newspaper articles dating back to the late 1800s reporting that the preparation and sharing of food was a main attraction at many Juneteenth celebrations. In 2020, following national protests against systemic racism and police violence, the holiday has gained larger attention outside of African American communities, and pressure builds on a federal level to recognize Juneteenth as a national holiday and America's legacy of racial oppression. A national celebration of Juneteenth was served every year to remind new generations of the events that triggered the events of Juneteenth and the challenges, responsibilities we face as Americans moving forward in racial equality. And this is the story of Juneteenth and why Juneteenth is an important holiday. Thank you. I'm Country Boy. This has been the story of Juneteenth. You can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you want to support this podcast, you can buy me coffee or support my Patreon. You can find those down in the show notes below. And lastly, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.